This program is brought to you in part by SalCal Real Estate Connections.
Yes, welcome back to History Lesson number 2 with George Dragon. And believe me, you're in for a treat today as we're going to be talking about a few more cars and going over the history of these cars. And as you will see, George is just a dictionary when it comes to the history of these cars, and he is so up to date on what is going on, and I can't just wait to talk to him again. Please give us feedback on tonight's show. What do you think about having a weekly show in the future with George Dragon regarding the history of the automobile? Please email us at raceaction@aol.com. Yes, George, we moved over to a different time frame, and I'll tell you, this car got my attention. 1935 Auburn Supercharged. I'm not sure of the model.
It's an 851 convertible sedan.
I mean, this car is gorgeous. Now, this being supercharged in this model, is this a very rare car?
Yeah, well, there only a small percentage were supercharged cars, but this one is in a four-door convertible is a little bit unusual. There's probably 30 that exist in the world that are known.
Were these mass produced? I mean, Auburn's back in the day. I mean, did they make a lot of these cars? Not this specific model, but Auburn in general.
Well, I'll give you a little history. This is part of the Auburn Cord Duesenberg family. Now, a lot of people don't know that Auburn started in business way back in 1904 and built two-cylinder cars to start and then four-cylinder cars. And then in the 20s, they became more of a generic looking car, very plain, dark colors. And the company was about to go out of business in the mid-20s, and along came a fellow by the name of E.L. Cord, who was a salesman, and he was hired by Auburn to see if he could sell off some of the leftover cars. So he walked around the factory, and he saw everything was dark blue or dark green. So he decided, he said, yes, we could sell these leftover cars if we paint them bright colors. So he painted lots of yellow, red, off-white, and bright blues. And the cars sold like crazy. They sold like, it was unbelievable. So he was making so much money in commission selling these cars that he bought part of the company, bought into the company. And he ended up owning the Auburn company in 1927. And it became very successful. He made sporty models with wire wheels, disc wheels, very sharp body styles, lots of roadsters. And
when did the Bowtail Speedster come about?
Well, the Auburn Bowtail Speedster came about, it was designed in 1928. That was the first year of the Bowtail Speedster, and it was a very pointed two-passenger car, not the most comfortable car to drive, but probably one of the sexiest cars built at the time. Now, this particular model, the 851 and 852, was built in 1935 and 36. Those were the only supercharged Bowtail Speedsters. Before that, they were not supercharged. They had straight-eight engines, Lycoming straight-eight engines. So when the Bowtail Speedster came out, it was an immediate hit, and the company was doing so well, he decided to team up with the Duesenberg brothers and to build the Model J Duesenberg, which was the mightiest of all motor cars, was America's greatest car at the time. So, and then 1929. He wanted to come out with a front-wheel drive car, so he named it after himself. It was the the L29 Cord, which came out in 1929. So
Well, they were different looking, huh?
yes, they were very low. Front-wheel drive was unheard of at the time, and the first ones were not that unusual looking, except for the low stance. But it wasn't until later that the front-wheel drive Cords of the 1930s, about the same time this car was built, 1936 and 7. They were radical hideaway headlights and pipes coming out of the hood like this on the supercharged cars.
Now tell me, the Cord had they were like electric automatics.
Well, there was electric vacuum shift. It still had a clutch, but because it was front-wheel drive, to shift it, they had a vacuum and electric setup on it.
I mean, these cars, like this car here, I mean, in their day, well, I'll tell you, you couldn't, I mean, they were just beautiful. I
Right.
mean, when you look at it, all the cars that particular group made, they were all beautiful cars.
Right, especially the Duesenberg. But every supercharged Allbird, the Speedsters anyway, were guaranteed to do over 100 miles an hour back then. So every Speedster came with a plaque that this famous race driver, Ab Jenkins' car would do at least 101 miles an hour or better. And that was fast for even for the mid 30s.
In the day, let me tell you, that was very fast.
For a production car, yes, it was.
So, I mean, it's hard to believe that the company, that they were involved with, Auburn and Duesenberg and Cord, would go out of business. Isn't that kind of hard to believe?
Well, they only survived till 1937 because of the Depression, and the Cords and Auburns. People felt funny if people were out of work during the Depression, and even though they weren't expensive, this was not an expensive car. This car was $2,275 when it was new. Now, sure, a Dodge or a Chevy was $800 or $900, but still, people felt funny driving such an ostentatious car around during the Depression. So sales were low. And especially the Duesenbergs were very expensive, way over $10,000. You had to be a special person to own a Duesenberg. But these cars, a lot survived. They were new enough that they weren't crushed for the World War II scrap drives, and a lot of them survived. And they were always considered great classics. When the Classic Car Club of America started way back in the early '50s, this was one of the first cars that they had on their list for certified classics.
Now, talk to me about the engine in this car. What basically is the engine?
It's a Lycoming straight 8 engine with a supercharger.
And I mean, how, as far as parts go and what exists today, is it easy to get stuff for this?
Well, because the hobby is so great today, and a lot of these cars are still around, yes, there's lots of reproduction parts, but there's plenty of original parts too, because when the company went out of business, they did not scrap all the leftover parts from the Auburn company. They still supplied owners right up until the 1960s with Auburn and Cord parts, not Duesenberg parts, but Auburn and Cord parts. And they were built in Auburn, Indiana, where the Auburn Cord Duesenberg Museum is. And that's where the parts company was, right up. And there's still parts around. As a matter of fact, I met a fellow at Hershey this year who bought a huge supply of Auburn and Cord mechanical parts that was left over from the factory. So they did not scrap them. They still, had individual companies still working on these cars.
Yeah, they were special cars, I'll tell you. It's so hard to understand how they would just go away, because of different problems with, depression and that.
Right. Well, it was lots of companies. We lost Pierce Arrow. Lots of different companies in the 1930s because of the Depression. It was only the great cars. There were small companies too, like Hupmobile and some of the other smaller companies didn't survive. They did survive till 1941, but the Depression was very deep, and they weren't selling these cars, and E.L. Cord couldn't hang on to the company if he wasn't selling cars.
Yeah, let me tell you, he had to be a pretty ingenious person to do what he did to begin with.
Yes, he was very smart. He was a great salesman. He knew what people wanted, what it was going to take to make a flashy car, and to sell cars. He knew what to design, and he hired great designers too. So the Auburns and Cords were designed by some of the best classic era designers at that time, and you know, this is a classic look with the pipes coming out of the hood, that beautiful hood ornament. The grille is really unique, so it's quite a car. And the windshield folds down on this car. People still like to drive with the wind in their faces at that time.
Oh yeah, I'd love to drive it myself right now.
But it's got a factory tachometer. These all have, you know, we're guaranteed to go over 100 miles an hour. So if you wanted to go fast, you bought an Auburn or a Accord.
Absolutely, I'll tell you. Beautiful cars, and this car is gorgeous, really. Well, we're going to move over to another time frame, and as usual, George, you know what's going on with these cars.
Thank you very much, Larry.
I want to tell you, this Auburn was just an absolutely gorgeous car. I just can't get over how beautiful these cars were in the day. And George just knows exactly what's going on with them. Please give us feedback about these cars as we in show, and believe me, we look forward to doing more shows with George. Please give us feedback on tonight's show. What do you think about having a weekly show in the future with George Dragon regarding the history of the automobile? Please email us at raceaction@aol.com. Yes, George, we moved over to another very interesting car, and I am just at awe because I have never seen one like this. Tell me something about this 1932 Hudson. It is just gorgeous.
Okay, it's a 1932 Hudson 8-cylinder convertible coupe, designed by Murphy Body Company and built by Briggs. Was a show car that was specially built by Hudson and designed by the fellows at Murphy to try to drum up some custom bodied work. You know, in the depths of the Depression, especially in 1932, there were very few custom cars being built at the time. They were very expensive. The designers at Murphy thought if they could do a few cars for a company like Hudson, that maybe they get some specialty design work. Now, this car was built and shown at the Paris Auto Show in 1932, and then came back and was at the New York Auto Show. It is, as far as we know, the only existing 32 Hudson convertible coupe with a rumble seat. And they built a custom, before this they built a custom convertible sedan, a 4-door convertible, which was all white with gold trim. And they built this car, which is we restored in the original colors of black with orange trim.
This is the original color? Oh my dear, I can't get over the fact that that's what they had back then.
Yes, well, it was flashy, but still in a dark color. It wasn't as flashy as the pearl white 4-door convertible. It's just the opposite. But this car was, you know, it was kind of a special car at the time. If you notice the low roof, and Hudson, it's a straight 8, so Hudson did have a performance reputation right from the teens. You know, Hudson was one of the first cars to win the race up Pikes Peak in 1916. They raced at Sheepshead Bay board track and won in 1916. So they always had a performance reputation. And right up through the 30 suit. This is a sort of short wheelbase, a 119-inch wheelbase car with a very large straight 8 engine at the time, big carburetor. But they tried to promote these cars, and sales were very low in 1932 and 33.
Tell me, what does a car like this cost you back then?
This was not an expensive car. It was probably around $1,400 in 1932. The sedans were a little bit cheaper. Coupes and sedans were in the $1,000 range. But the convertibles were a little bit more expensive. But we don't know the production figures of how many convertible coupes were built. There isn't an even original factory photo. They just used a drawing in the sales literature. We bought this car. It's an interesting story. It was in a garage behind an old Hudson AMC dealership in Peekskill, New York, since 1957. And when I tell you, I think the roof leaked since 1958 in that garage. The car was pretty much all surface rust and was in very poor condition. But it was in this garage, and we originally went there. It was an old-time collector who had it since '57, but he also owned a 1950 Hudson with 5,000 original miles, and a very special body Hudson called a Hudson Italia. They built 25 coupes, and they built one concept four-door sedan. So this fellow had it was called the X161 1954 Hudson Italia four-door. So that's the car we really were after. And then when we went in this garage, here we saw this 32 convertible coupe. Even though it was in rough condition, we tried to buy it. And that was in 1985, and we weren't able to buy it till 2005. By that time, the fellow was 94 years old, and I think he realized partly that he wouldn't ever see it be restored, or he wouldn't be able to restore it. But the fact was, kids broke into the garage where these cars were stored, and they vandalized this car. So it was not only unrestored, but they jumped on the hood and broke the headlights and really did a number on this car. And but not the Hudson Italia, and the 50 Hudson with 5,000 miles only broke the glass on it. So we were able to buy all the cars, and it was at the 11th hour. I'll tell you how we got these cars. A fellow finally called us up and said, would you be interested in the 32 Hudson and the other cars? And we said, of course. This was on a Thursday. So he said, well, you have to come up right now and let's negotiate. So we drove up to Peekskill, New York, and went in the garage, and the cars, we saw they were vandalized, and the whole building was in such bad repair. So we made a deal on the cars, and he said, fine, but you have to have them out tomorrow by 4 o'clock, because I'm closing on the building at 5 p.m. and the building has to be empty. So I had one day, just about 24 hours, less than 24 hours, to remove all these cars that had been sitting. This one since the other car since the 60s. So it was, and it was in the middle of February with snow on the ground. So it was quite an adventure extracting these cars out of this building that was in really bad condition.
I can't imagine. I can't of doing something like that.
Right. Well, you know, I was very determined to get them out of there. The other two cars were easy. This one was a little tough with 4 flat tires. And I was very sad that the headlights and the side lights were broken. The kids vandalized them. And on the way out of the garage, I looked over in a corner, and there was a pile of boxes, all wet cardboard. So I went through the boxes hoping to find something that would, you know, for one of the cars. And then finally in the bottom box was an extra set of headlights and side lights, all complete.
Wow.
So that was really one of the biggest obstacles. Everything else was in poor condition, except for the hood ornament, which I had to source, but everything else was complete on the car, but rusty and in very poor condition. So it took us, we bought it in 2005. I searched for a few other parts and doing research, and then we started working on the car in late 2013, and then we just finished it in just this past year. We had it.
I have to give you so much credit to have the foresight to know what this car was going to look like in the end.
Well, you know, we've been doing it for 37 years, so I could see, you know, that the car was going to be a beautiful car when it was restored. But it really, when stripping the car, we did find that it was the original colors of black with orange, but it was all surface rust, so it was very difficult until we took the fenders off and looked under the car. And it has an orange chassis too, which is, if we looked at the photo when I was at the Paris Auto Show, they described it in one of the French car magazines as being, you know, of unusual black and orange color.
I'll tell you, whatever they did is beautiful. It is just beautiful. Well, George, we come to the end of talking about this car, and hopefully we're going to see what we're going to do down the road.
All right, thank you, Larry.
Yes, George, we came across another very interesting car at your other facility here where you actually do all the restoration work. And I'll tell you, I have never seen or heard of this car. This is by Ray, and it's a 4-cylinder. Now tell me, what is the history about this car?
Well, it's a 1904 Bar-A semi-racer. It's a four-cylinder, one of the first of these front-engined four-cylinder cars that were very fast for the time. Now, Bar-A was a company that started in France in 1900, and it was a small company that lasted until the 1920s. What's significant about this car is it's very early. It may even be, we're calling it a 1904, but until we do further research, it may even be a 1903. There are other Bar-A cars that exist, but they're all one-cylinder cars, and that's what they started building in 1900, were single-cylinder. By this time, 1903, 1904, bigger was better. Panhard Levasseur, Mercedes, they were all front-engine four-cylinder cars that something like this would have been used for racing, or the buyer, the original owner, would have been someone that was interested in going fast.
Now, when you say racing, you talking about racing in Europe?
Right, right. Road racing. Racing was very popular all over Europe, even back to the 19th century. And they called them races, but it was more of a town to town or city to city race. And a very famous race in 1903 was a Paris to Madrid race, where this would have been the type of car that would have been entered in the race at that time. And that's a long road race, hundreds of miles, grueling 24-hour race, and over dirt roads with lots of ruts and rocks. And so you needed a bigger car. The smaller cars, single cylinder or even two-cylinder cars, pretty much were not even entered, and very few were entered in that race in 1903. But it was big four-cylinder cars like this that were powerful enough to go 40 miles an hour for many hours at a time.
Now, let me ask you a question. When they entered these cars in a race like that, was that basically to get credibility for your car as advertising or selling the car?
Absolutely right. That's the only way that would have gotten your name in the paper, is if you won a race or came in the top three. It's the only way. This was before radio, television, newspaper, newspaper stories or magazine articles about cars were the only way to get publicity at that time, unless you bought ads. But they felt if a car like this would have won a race or come in within the top five, that the car was very reliable and it was a good car to buy for, your family or as an individual to buy a car at that time. So it was more of a reliability race, that the cars would stay together, and winning the race, of course, was a big deal at that time. But this is before 1905 or before 1904, before the Vanderbilt Cup race, before the big international races like the French Grand Prix or some of the other races that were going on at the time.
Would you rate this car as being maybe a better car than an American-built car of the time?
The French really were far superior than anything we were building. There were some great car builders that participated in these races over there, like Winton, Alexander Winton. Winton cars were built in Cleveland. Even Henry Ford built some early race cars from 1901. Before he even started his company, he knew he built a car called the Sweepstakes Racer, the 1901, and then the Ford 999 that Barney Oldfield started to drive back in 1903. And he knew, even Henry Ford, he was a master of publicity, so he knew that to get his name in the paper, to do just what we discussed about win the races, go the fastest. He even came to Ormond Beach, Florida, to race against trying to set the land speed record, even with a Ford in the early days.
So yeah, he knew right up front that was how important racing was at the time.
Right. That's how the only way you got your name in the paper was to win a race or to be in a top five.
How long did these cars, as far as the guy that was building these cars, how long did he last doing that?
Well, he would start in Bar-A himself started in 1900, and the company lasted to the 20s. But cars like this, very big, expensive ones, I think only lasted till maybe around 1910. And then because of the taxation in Europe on the horsepower and the size of the engine, they started building smaller cars, cars for the masses, like a Model T.
Yeah, I mean, back then it was a new ball. It was a different ball game, you know.
Right, absolutely. Well, it's like here in the U.S., there was over 3,000 different car manufacturers that tried, building cars. In Europe, there was probably twice as many.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I want to tell the viewers that we're going to look into possibly coming up with a show series to talk about those 3,000 cars. What do you think of that?
I think it would be great. The history, people would find it fascinating. The history of the automobile is fascinating.
Well, I'll tell you what, we don't want to take any more of your time up, George. You've been excellent today, and I can't wait to come back down and talk to you about more of those cars in your showroom, and we're going to get some pilot shows together to talk about this history of the automobile.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
sir. You were excellent.
Thank you.
Please give us feedback on tonight's show. What do you think about having a weekly show in the future with George Dragon regarding the history of the automobile? Please email us at raceaction@aol.com. Please return next week to our next episode of Racing Action Today.